Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Every Day is Friday. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. Let's get into it. Today, I'm really excited to welcome Anthony to the podcast. We're going to be diving into what freedom really means and the heavy price that has been paid for it. We're going to talk about a lot of different topics today. I'm really looking forward to it, Anthony.
Thank you. And once again, it's a pleasure for me to be here again talking about, a subject that is very passionate to me, which is history. Maybe someday I'll figure out how to make some money off of doing it too. But for right now, it's just a hobby and something I really enjoy.
And for the listeners who may not be familiar with your line of work yet, Anthony, can you give us a quick rundown of who you are and what you do?
Yes. So I'm a veteran of the United States Navy. I served in the country's Navy for 11 years. And then I got out, and using the post 9/11 GI Bill, I was able to get a bachelor's in history from the University of South Florida. And then I also recently just completed my master's in law, also using the GI Bill through Regent University in Virginia Beach.
And there's a lot of different topics we'll be talking about today, and let's get right into it. I mean, what was the American Revolution really about?
So it's become, in modern times, it's become kind of debated exactly what the real justifications were. The ones that we pretty much hear all the time are taxation without representation, which is essentially that, we were being taxed by the British government without having any actual say in Parliament. The colonies had no representatives within the British Parliament. So they're like, we're paying these taxes and you don't give us any say in what happens within our own, within our territories. And then there was also a series of tax acts that were enacted. Like there was the tea tax, which ultimately was, the result of that was the Boston Tea Party, where, Americans dressed up as Native Americans and then threw the tea off the boat. Everyone kind of knows about that. That's taught pretty commonly in like U.S. history classes. And then there was also what was called the Insufferable Acts, which were a series of political decisions by Parliament to implement various laws in the colonies that kind of restricted our trade rights, and was one of them. And also there was the Quartering Act, which basically meant that British soldiers, while in the colonies, were to be provided quarters, which is another word for like a barracks or a place to stay, to sleep, while they were in the colonies by the colonists. So if you were, say, in Boston, Massachusetts, and a ship of British sailors or soldiers came in, there was a high chance that they would just knock on your door and be like, under the terms of the Quartering Act, you have to provide us with a place to sleep for the night.
I just want to say it's the easy way to say it's just about freedom. But I mean, there was real people that were fighting and dying in this American Revolution. I mean, about 25,000 Americans died. I mean, that's more than the population of small towns today. I mean, fighting just to be free from the king.
Well, the American Revolution was also a very long war. It was about 7-8 years in length, which for that time period, wars tended to be a little bit shorter than that on average, but because of like different impacts of weather and seasons, there's a lot of gaps where like there's not really anything happening because the weather is too bad to actually conduct military operations. For example, during one of the winters, that's where George Washington took our troops to Valley Forge to basically weather out the winter. The winter was so bad there that people were getting sick. There was a smallpox outbreak amongst the troops. And thanks to some ingenuitive thinking, which was also highly controversial for the time, Washington actually decided to purposely infect all of his healthy troops with smallpox by basically cutting them on the arm and applying some of the pus from a smallpox blister into that cut, which would cause the smallpox to form on the outside of the skin as opposed to it forming internally. And because of that, the majority of the people he actually infected survived. Whereas if smallpox will develop inside you, it's pretty lethal.
It's amazing how he knew that at that time period.
Well, he had actually survived a bout of smallpox as a child, so he knew how deadly it was. And because of that, he had an army after the winter passed. And also, while in Valley Forge, they've really focused on the training of the army, with better tactics and things, so that once the winter ends and he comes out of Valley Forge, our army tended to perform much better at that time because they had gone through the rigorous styles of European warfare fighting and training.
Yeah, what was the fighting like back then?
So, muskets. Musket firearms are pretty inaccurate. And that's because the way that a musket generally works is that it's basically a long tube that has a round ball that it shoots straight through the tube using gunpowder, where you have to first, basically you apply a measured amount of gunpowder into the barrel. You then put the ball inside the tube, and using what they called a ramrod, you would jam the ball all the way to the bottom of that barrel. And then the way that they would fire is that they had what was called a flintlock, which is basically a lever that pulls back, and there's like a metal plate. It strikes, and there's like a small bit of paper wadding that comes out of the back of the barrel and onto that plate. And so when you pull the trigger, that lever goes forward, it strikes the plate, causing sparks, which ignite that basically that fuse, which by proxy ignites the gunpowder and propels that round ball forward. Now, because of how inaccurate muskets were, the general tactics of the time were to basically take your troops. You formed what was called a line. So you had I'm not exactly sure how many men comprised, one line at that time. Basically, you would get a bunch of men, put them in a straight line facing towards the enemy, and then, there might be like 2 or 3 other ranks behind them, and you would march them forward. And when they were told to fire, they would all fire their muskets basically at the same time. And that the theory behind this was that by using this mass firing, you increased your chances of hitting the enemy's line as much as possible because of how inaccurate muskets were. Now, later on, with the invention of what's called rifling, which is basically where you take the barrel of the gun and with a giant screw, you basically grind it through the barrel all the way to the bottom, which creates grooves inside the barrel, so that when you fire a rifle, the rifle puts a spin on the bullet, so that when it exits as it's exiting the tube, it's actually spinning. And because of that, it's much more stable and flies generally farther and more accurately. It's the same concept as how when football players throw the football, they put a spiral on it. It makes it more stable. Typically, the tactics of the time were you got your musket formations in lines, you marched them towards the enemy. As they were marching towards each other, you would have artillery, cannons firing of different weights, firing cannonballs onto the advancing enemy to try to break their morale and also, cause mass casualty. And they would also sometimes do a fire at will, where they would, after firing a volley or two, they would just be kind of told fire at will, and then they would basically reload their muskets and fire just as often as they could. And then the other primary tactic was using cavalry, which, if you've ever seen the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson, the British Dragoons are those cavalry guys that ride up with swords and basically just hack down groups that are their morale's breaking or they're retreating. They just kind of hack them down.
Now, what were some of the biggest battles fought in the Revolutionary War?
So there's a few pretty distinct ones. One I wanted to primary focus on is the Battle of Saratoga. Now, this battle, it technically occurred on two separate dates because the first battle actually takes place in a farm outside of the fortress, which was on September 19th, 1777. That battle basically halted the British advance that was trying to come to the fort. And because of like nighttime falling and the weather conditions, basically like the American troops then retreated after they had basically stopped the advance and went back to the fort. And then the Brits basically were not able to actually approach and try to take the fort until October 7th, 77, which is why there's two dates for that specific battle.
Yeah, why was the Battle of Saratoga such a big deal?
So, the biggest, it's considered the turning point of the war for the American Revolution. And, a lot of the reasons why are number one, we didn't not really had that many successful victories against the British up until this point. This one was kind of our first very successful battle, which boosted the morale of the American troops and the American citizens. France, who had been in negotiations with us to formally recognize us as our own nation, had been kind of sitting on the fence making that decision. They didn't really approve of the guerrilla warfare tactics that we had been using in the earlier parts of the war. They really only wanted to support a country that was going to use like formal European warfare tactics. But this battle kind of changed their mind, and they were like, oh, these Americans can actually put up a good fight. And the French and the Brits at this time were rivals and had, been fighting wars against each other quite frequently. And so at this point, like France formally says, okay, the United States will recognize you as an independent, entity, and we will now start providing you with military and financial support. Also, the locations of the battles that were fought after the Battle of Saratoga shifted. Originally, a lot of the battles were being fought in the northern colonies, later northern states. And then once at post-Battle of Saratoga, the Brits were basically forced into the South. And so the majority of battles that take place afterwards are fought in the southern states.
Now,
And
Anthony, what did freedom mean to people back then?
so, you know, when the American Revolution first breaks out, originally not everybody was on the side of independence. They mostly just wanted to be treated as equal British citizens. And so the thought was that, we'll basically put up this revolution to make them listen to us, and then, we'll have our say in Parliament, and if we're going to be taxed, we're going to get our say too. But once it was clear that, the Brits really weren't willing to do that, then and because of some of the incidents that occurred with, British troops against, American civilians, and that more and more the concept of independence became a moving factor, which of course is why, the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th, 1776. And so after that date, the goal was we're going to free ourselves from the British and become our own nation.
Yeah, I mean, moments like that really connect what we value now.
Right. And also, even though for the most part, the colonial era and powers are gone, because most of them ended after World War I or were significantly weakened after World War I, there is still a lot of European influence amongst other nations throughout the world. And, whereas since the American Revolution and the following, war, the War of 1812, been able to maintain our independence.
So after the War of Saratoga, France officially joined the war on the American side?
Yes, they did. They started providing us with like training and military aid, and they also, part of their biggest aid they gave us was the usage of their fleet. Because at the time, we had purchased some old French merchant vessels and kind of reconfigured them to be warships, but they, we couldn't take on the British fleet. And so when the French got involved, they started providing naval support as one of their biggest supports to us. And ultimately, they also helped blockade ports in the U.S. that were British controlled so that the Brits could not resupply their troops in those specific ports.
So without that one battle, we might not have any help from any other countries.
Correct. Had we lost the Battle of Saratoga, the outcome of the war, we might be British citizens to this day.
Crazy to think about history like that, how one thing could change everything.
Yep. And part of why that battle was considered such a success for us, if you look at the statistics I've got displayed here, only 90 of our troops were killed and about 240 were wounded, compared to the British and their German allies who lost 440 men were killed, 695 were wounded, and a little over 6,000 were captured. So that was a huge, in a numbers game, that's a huge win for us.
I'll fight for freedom just to get away from a king.
And then, so yeah, like to briefly go over like what the American Navy at this time was doing. Mostly we were involved in kind of a commerce raiding, where we were trying to interrupt British trade, which that's something you see throughout a lot of war, even into more modern times, is that raiding your enemy's trade assets, their trade ships, and that is basically one of the best ways to demoralize and also weaken them.
And what year was the Navy formed in the United States?
So the American Navy actually predates the country by almost a year, because the U.S. Navy was formed on October 13th, 1875. It was the Continental Navy at the time. It basically it's been in existence ever since. So that's the U.S. Navy's birthday. We always celebrate October 13th, 1975.
So it's older than the United States.
Yes.
Fascinating. Now, is there anything else you want to share about the American Revolution?
For this, I mostly wanted to focus just on this specific battle for the American Revolution because of the amount of topics we're covering today. I've basically, I picked 3 wars and 3 specific battles to focus on. Otherwise, I think we get a little too lost in the sauce.
And it's all these battles are all fought for freedom.
Yes. So if we want, we can move on to the War of 1812.
The War of 1812, everybody. What was the War of 1812 all about?
So the War of 1812, in a way, is Britain's second attempt at subjugating us. Because a lot of how this conflict started was that the British Navy was harassing American merchant vessels and was capturing American sailors and basically pressing them into service into the British Navy and saying, you can either die or you can join the British Navy because you're really British citizens. And they did not want to recognize us as an independent nation, and basically saw this as an opportunity to retake what they had lost.
Now, during this war, why was the Battle of New Orleans such a big win?
So throughout most of the War of 1812, a lot of, there's no major territorial gains throughout most of the war. Whatever territories were taken by either side were kind of reconquered. So there, as a land war, there wasn't these huge territorial gains, with the exception kind of this battle, with the Battle of New Orleans. Now, the interesting thing about this battle is it technically takes place after the war has already ended, because the Treaty of Ghent had been signed between our representatives and the British in December of 1814. However, that was in the Netherlands, the Netherlands or Sweden. I can't remember exactly where Ghent is, but because of how long it took information to travel, this battle, the people involved were not aware that the war had ended. And so technically, it's a war fought after the battle was, it's a battle fought after the war is already over, but it was a huge success for uh, us, the Americans.
Not a lot of people understand or even know about the War of 1812.
Yes, it's not really taught that much or very briefly, which is sad because it's very important. I mean, one of the things that happened during this war was that the British burned the White House to the ground. They actually made landfall, got to Washington, D.C., and they burnt the White House to the ground, and it was rebuilt post-war. You know, this was, basically this was they were very dedicated to trying to resubjugate us. They were
How
not, because it was an international embarrassment to them that their colony had defeated them.
Now, why did the British come back in 1812?
There are various things that were going on throughout the world. Part of the issue is that the Napoleonic Wars had been going on because after our successful revolution, the French decided to have their own revolution, uh, and that's how Napoleon came to power. And then Napoleon basically tried to conquer all of Europe. And so in the early 1800s, the British were mostly dealing with Napoleon. But after that, conflict kind of ended, then they decided to refocus on us.
It sounds like it gave the country a huge confidence boost after we won that war.
Yes, there were a lot of challenges post American Revolution, though. Like the country kind of almost fell apart not too long after the war ended because there was a lot of administrative issues. Um, there was basically a mutiny where a lot of the troops who had fought in the American Revolution were not getting the money that they were promised. And so they basically formed up and were like, we're going to stomp on Washington and get our money, even if we got to steal it from the people's houses. And famously, the only thing that stopped them was apparently George Washington rode out and met these guys and talked with them and was basically able to talk them down. And there's a lot of them had fought with him, so they were like, oh, okay, he's right. This isn't the right way to handle this and that. But yeah, especially the tax system. The early American tax system was very, it wasn't functional because the idea was, oh well, just pay the tax that you think is appropriate or what you can. And a lot of people are like, well, then I don't feel I have to pay anything. And so yeah, like if the government is not bringing in taxes and it promised to pay these troops, then there's no money to pay them.
Mm-hmm.
But yes. But yeah, so the Battle of New Orleans, part of what makes this such a significant event is not only does it take place after the war has ended, it's another example of how we took very little losses and heavily wounded and killed the enemy. And it basically, if I go back to the picture here, part of the picture got cut off. Essentially, this battle took place across a river, well, the Mississippi River. And so, you had the forces build up these barricades and then basically shot at the British as the British tried to cross the river.
Now, I remember Andrew Jackson being a huge influence in this battle. Is that
Yes.
true?
Yes. So Andrew Jackson, he was already fairly famous in his home state, uh, and he was because he was basically a self-taught man. He didn't have what we would consider a formal education nowadays, but he was also a lawyer. this battle cemented him as a national American hero. Later on, he became the seventh president of the United States of America.
Yeah, he's a war hero who turned into a leader.
Yeah. He was also very charismatic, and he was considered the first populist president because most of the people who'd been presidents before him, they would do campaigning, but they pretty much, they talked in a manner that was very like they were well educated, and they talked in like basically a fancy way that didn't really appeal to like the common person and stuff like that. And Andrew Jackson was kind of he had like much he wasn't really that wealthy when he was young and struggled quite a bit as, a youth, but like he built himself up. And so he kind of became like a symbol of what you could do in this country as, you could start with nothing and build yourself up. And then, of course, because he was a celebrated military hero, that also, made him very popular with a lot of people in the country. You know, Another, who also should be mentioned is John Lafitte, who was basically a French privateer pirate who operated out of New Orleans, and he basically, him and Andrew Jackson buddied up for this battle, and so Lafitte was basically providing like naval engagement and support against the British Navy, while Andrew Jackson focused on like the ground side of it. But the other thing that's interesting of this battle is that the British actually outnumbered us. We had about 5,700 men. The British had about 8,000 men. But because of how well the fortifications were set up and because of weather conditions, we only lost 13 men and had 39 wounded, with 19 missing or captured, whereas the British lost 291 killed, 1,262 wounded, and almost 500 captured.
Wow, that has to be one of the most lopsided victories in American history.
Yes, well, part of what happened during this battle is that there was a heavy fog in the morning, and the British were trying to use the fog as cover to approach the fortifications. And as they were marching forward, the fog lifted. And so as soon as we saw them, we could already hear that they were coming. We just couldn't see them. As soon as they were seen, they just opened fire and started obliterating them.
So, why was the Battle of New Orleans such a big win?
So, not only, number one, it basically serves as another international embarrassment to the British because they were, once again, they failed to subjugate us, especially with like a superior military force in that sense, numerically. Like I said, the battle was fought after the treaty had already been signed, but neither side had got the message yet. And so, like, they were basically trying to use this as like their last effort to take some territory from us. And this is a port, New Orleans is a port city. So if they had taken New Orleans, they basically would have controlled all the trade down the Mississippi River. And so by losing that, by not being able to take it, we, certified our control over this area. And then not too long after this war, you have the Louisiana Purchase, where we, purchased the territory of Louisiana from the French, which also expanded it started our expansion westward.
Yeah, we expanded pretty quickly, it looks like. And
Yes.
It sounds like it gave our country a huge confidence boost.
Yeah, well, especially because, at this time, the British had been considered the strongest empire. And so we defeated them twice within a period of about 20 years. And, so that started to cause like international opinion to change about the British, that they weren't maybe as strong as they were claiming to be. And also, brought us to the forefront where they're like, hey, look at this, this United States thing seems to be better than what we thought it was going to be.
And the consistency of just fighting just to be free from a king.
Right. Now, shifting to the naval side of this conflict. While not a lot of land was exchanged in this war. This war really shifted the balance of power for navies in our favor. There's a really good book called Six Frigates. I can't remember the author's name at this moment, but it basically is a historical book talking about the 6 American frigates that were commissioned prior to this war, one of them being the USS Constitution, known as Old Ironsides. That these ships were revolutionary for the time. They integrated new technologies in ship design, especially using copper plating on the hull, which reinforced their hulls. It's very famous. The reason Constitution is called Old Ironsides is in one of the first battles it participated in, the British cannonballs were bouncing off the side of the hull instead of penetrating. And one of the sailors is quoted as saying, "Huzzah, the sides are made of iron." And, because of these advances in technology and tactics, we were able to, even though our Navy was much smaller than the British Navy, we were able to defeat them in large-scale engagements because our ships were, like these frigates were faster and more maneuverable than the large British ships of the line. And so we would just outmaneuver them and just hit them with cannon. And it got so bad for the Brits that near the end of the war, the British Admiralty told their fleet commanders that if you come across American frigates, you are not to engage unless you have numerical superiority and only on your best judgment. So they're essentially telling their captains to avoid our frigates at all costs unless you have a huge advantage.
I feel like this has been skipped in school. This is one of the most. This is one of the battles that have that matters. Probably one of the most. If we lose that port, I mean, who knows?
Right. Well, more than likely the Louisiana Purchase wouldn't have occurred. And that's the thing too. Is like, even though the treaty had already been signed, what's to say that if they had taken this port, that the Brits might have decided to change their mind and be like, well, we were able to take this, so we might as well just keep the war going.
Mm-hmm.
But this was, so this once again is like a huge embarrassment to the British. And after this war, they didn't try to subjugate us again militarily.
And the next battle was probably the Civil War.
Yes. All right. So one more thing about the Navy is because of the outcome of the naval side of this war, it changed our nation from a more isolationist, mind our own business, nation to basically an international naval power. We started to spread our influence, with trade and diplomacy to other parts of the world that we originally had no interest in.
And look at us now. We're everywhere around the world.
Yep.
The United States is.
70% of the world's covered in water. If it's deep enough for our ships to go, they'll go there. All right. So, unless you want to discuss anything else, I guess we'll move on to the Battle of Gettysburg.
Yeah, the Battle of Gettysburg is one of the. It's a really gruesome battle.
And so, the Civil War tends to be taught pretty well in American history classes, especially because of the fact that it's basically the war that decides the question of slavery. Should this institution of slavery continue, or is it inhumane and does it need to stop? Because the way the majority of the South saw it is like, it's just our way of life. We own slaves and they harvest our crops. And the North was like, slavery is an abomination. The Constitution of the United States says that all men were created equal, but are they? That was kind of the question. And so
in the Civil War, Americans died more than any other war.
Yes. To this date, it's been our bloodiest conflict. Civil wars tend to be that way though, because it's a war of brothers against brothers.
Yeah, it's actually it's how it is. I mean, it's just shocking to me that more Americans died in that war more than World War I, World War II, and Vietnam combined.
Well, a lot of that's because, with the exception of attack on Pearl Harbor, 1941, December 7th. We haven't faced invasion or battles within our own, like within the continental US or like that, so like for the most part, since World War II, like very beginning of World War II for us, the average day American, unless they were in the military and went off to fight, was safe at home. It didn't really have to experience those things. But of course, in World War II, you had a huge draft, and majority of men that were capable went. A lot of them didn't have to be drafted. A lot of them volunteered. Especially after Pearl Harbor, there was a huge spike in voluntary enlistments following the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Now, how did they get soldiers for the Battle of Gettysburg?
So during the Civil War, there was a voluntary enlistment, but there was also like a limited kind of conscription, where basically they could conscript you, which is another terminology for draft, into service for a period of time. And it would say like you need to come and fight in the U.S. Army for 2 years. And once that time was up, you could either voluntarily stay or be sent home. And that was if you were still alive at that point. Especially with the Civil War, a lot of these battles were pretty brutal.
Yeah, very. I mean, the Battle of Gettysburg, I mean, over like 51,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or even missing in just 3 days.
Yep.
It's mind-blowing.
Yeah. And here are the facts for that battle. The leaders of the two armies, so you have the United States Union forces, which were being led by General George Meade, with the Army of the Potomac as the primary unit engaged. He had somewhere between 93,000 to 104,000 men, which included 360 artillery pieces and 36 cavalry regiments. The Union forces took about 23,049 casualties and losses. The Confederate state forces were being led by General Robert E. Lee, who was also the primary general of the Confederate Army, with his Army of Northern Virginia. His army consisted of somewhere between 65,000 to 75,000 men, including 270 artillery pieces, 9,500 cavalry units, and estimated casualties and losses, but somewhere between 23,000 to 28,000. Now, as you said, yes, like casualties on both sides of this battle were very high. This is the bloodiest battle that occurred during the Civil War. This battle consisted of, you have the United States Union forces being led by General George Meade and the Army of the Potomac as the primary unit fighting, which consisted of about 93,000 to 104,000 men, which included 360 artillery pieces and 36 cavalry regiments. The Army of the Potomac took an estimated 23,049 casualties and losses. The opposing side was the Confederate State Forces led by General Robert E. Lee, leader of the Confederate military, with his Army of Northern Virginia. His estimated strength was between 65,000 to 75,000 men, including 270 artillery pieces, 9,500 cavalry units, and it's estimated that the Confederates took somewhere between 23,000 to 28,000 casualties and losses. And as you said, yes, there was high casualties on both sides of this battle, but it ultimately was a Union Army victory. And it shifts the momentum of the war by heavily boosting the morale, because this was a humongous victory, and basically inspired the Union to, continue pressing the fight and led to further victories in the future. This was Robert E. Lee's second attempt to invade the North. It ended in ultimate failure, and it was a devastating defeat. And the Confederate defeat caused a high morale loss. And basically, the Union troops chased the Confederacy back into the South following this war. This battle.
Why is the Gettysburg considered a turning point in the war?
Mostly because of what I just said there, where it was a huge morale boost for the Union because it was the Union's first large-scale victory, even though it was a very costly one. Robert E. Lee was considered to be like the best general of the South, and he was basically humiliated in this battle and had to retreat. And so it was like, oh, we were able to defeat their so-called best general and push him back. And so now, like, following this battle, the momentum of the Union became primarily the Union had been on like a defensive side of the war prior to this, and now we went on an offensive and we're chasing them back into the South.
Now, how did the Battle of Gettysburg help lead the end of slavery?
So this whole war was really about the question of slavery, like should it continue or should it come to an end? But with this battle specifically, Abraham Lincoln, our president at the time, who also, ended slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation, he really thought about the suffering and the sacrifice for this question of freedom. And so I actually have a copy of his Gettysburg Address that I'll read. Let me bring it up here really quick.
Yeah, what did Lincoln do during this time that really stood out to you?
Well, so number one, the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all, African Americans would be free within the United States and formally ends slavery. Now, granted, there were still slaves in the South, like they had to be freed as the military got to them. But basically, they basically said, that's it. We are saying it's done. It's over. And it also, the other thing too is that Abraham Lincoln also allowed African Americans to start volunteering to serve in the Union Army. One of the most famous is the Massachusetts 44th, led by Robert Shaw, which there's actually a movie about them, which is called Glory, which is a very well done movie. It's got Matthew Broderick, Morgan Freeman, and I can't remember his name right now. I'm killing myself with this. But there's a lot of big name actors in this film. And it's a true story, and it's a very, well done film. I definitely recommend any fan of history or would want to know more about this topic to look at that film. But so this copy of the Gettysburg Address is known as the Bliss copy. And basically, after Lincoln wrote it in 1864, this version has been the most reproduced, and it's on display at the walls of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. And it's named after Colonel Alexander Bliss, who is the stepson of historian George Bancroft. Bancroft had asked President Lincoln for a copy to use as a fundraiser for soldiers. However, because Lincoln wrote on both sides of the paper, the speech could not be reprinted, so Lincoln made another copy at Bliss' request. It was the last known copy written by Lincoln and the only one signed and dated by him. And today it's on display at the Lincoln Room of the White House. And so it begins, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any other nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those here who gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Abraham Lincoln, November 19th, 1863.
Freedom throughout our nation's history has changed so much in different ways. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, you're welcome. I hope I did it justice. It's just very, very passionate speech. And then, of course, sadly, not too long after the war, Lincoln's assassinated. And so there's question as to what the Reconstruction had already started to try to basically rebuild the South and bring it up to basically Northern standards, not only like economically and industrially, but also ethically in that sense and morality. But following Lincoln's death, a lot of the incentives that were put into place kind of lost traction, and I wonder how much different things would have turned out had Lincoln not been assassinated and continued on that fight for freedom. Because not too long after the Civil War ends and Reconstruction starts to fall apart, that's when you have the institution of the Jim Crow laws, which started saying, okay, well, black people don't have the same rights as white people. They might be free, but they're not the same as you and me. In the South, that was where a lot of that came into place. And the segregation movement saying that, well, because of the color of my skin and your skin, we can't drink from the same fountain. And those things didn't come to an end until the civil rights movement of the 1960s.
That battle was fought over 150 years ago, but it still seems to shape how we see freedom today.
Yes. And that's why I chose to focus on these specific wars with the concept of freedom, especially because it's the concept, it's our question of freedom as Americans. The first was to throw the shackles of British tyranny off. The second war was to keep the shackles of British tyranny off. This war was to end slavery. It was like, hey, we're supposed to be all created equal under God, but if you live in these southern states, you're somebody's property.
Yeah. And freedom always comes with a cost. I mean,
always.
There's a price tag of freedom, and every single generation has paid something towards that.
Yeah, there's a really powerful YouTube video called "The Star Spangled Banner" as you've never heard it before, and it tells the story of Francis Scott Key, who wrote "The Star Spangled Banner," our national anthem, which was written during the War of 1812. And it's basically it involved a battle against a fort where the British Navy was just decimating this fort. But they had sent a message to the people in the fort saying, all you have to do to stop the bombardment is to take that flag down and we won't shoot anymore. And so the whole night they just shot because like the flag would not come down. And at the next day, Francis Scott Key went into the fort. And what he found was that this flag was barely standing. It was torn. It was ripped. It was basically being held in place by the corpses of American patriots. And they figured out that this flag had taken multiple direct hits and had fallen. And the people who had held it up had died. And others had come and picked it back up and held it there until they died.
Freedom comes with a cost. And I know some stats I have here, and it says the total U.S. war deaths in history over America has been over 1.3 million Americans have died in U.S. wars. I mean, that's freedom.
Yes.
Anthony, what does freedom mean to you?
Freedom, a lot of people will say that freedom is the ability to do whatever you want to do. And I would argue, yes, but I think a better definition is freedom is what you do with the ability to do whatever you want to do. For example, I can legally buy as much alcohol as I want and drink myself into a stupor if I so choose to. But at the same time, I can make the choice to say, you know what? I don't need to do that. Or, I'm just going to have one drink and that's it. It's one of those things where there's, freedom's hard to define because some people, they're like, oh, I just want to do whatever I want to do. And then there's I can do that, but should I do that? And especially, I would say that once you take into factor, like you said, the amount of death that was spent for that freedom, do you really want to do the same things that you did before you knew it?
Yeah, freedom, there's so much blood that has been on this land and overseas and everywhere else just for freedom for Americans. What's one truth about life you wish more people understood?
I would say that if I could limit it to one thing, that life is fragile and it's precious. Don't squander it.
Anthony, the show is called Every Day is Friday, and I always say Friday has a special energy, whether it's freedom or excitement or just feeling of accomplishment after a long week. I want to hear from you, Anthony. What does Friday mean to you?
Friday, I think of Friday as the time when, it's the end of the work week and you begin the weekend. So it's kind of a time of celebration, but it's also a time of reflection as to, what did I get accomplished this week? What do I need to accomplish next week? How do I live tomorrow better than I lived today?
That mindset of anything is possible, celebration, and new beginnings, like you're saying. I mean,
Right.
every day is Friday mindset. I mean, bring it into your everyday lifestyle. That's what it's all about. And
But also that, like you said, anything is possible, but it also requires great sacrifice.
so true. That's a great takeaway. And Anthony, this is your chance to leave the listeners with something powerful. Is there anything else you want to share?
I would just say that, to all those who are watching this, I hope that you were able to learn something that you didn't know before, or even if you have heard it before, that you maybe heard a different perspective of it. Don't just take my word for it. Do your own research. I'm just a man. I make mistakes and don't remember everything all the time myself. But, I would say, really take to heart what I said there at the end about, if you want to do something in life, then do it, but understand that it will come with a cost.
And that's a wrap for this episode, everybody. And it's been an awesome conversation, Anthony. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you. I'm once again thrilled to be here, and I look forward to our next one.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to our next one as well. And thank you for sharing your stories and experiences and all the knowledge you have. And to everyone listening, stay tuned for more amazing stories on Every Day is Friday 365. If you enjoyed this, make sure you follow and share and keep that Every Day is Friday mindset going. Stay inspired and make every day feel like Friday. Until next time, everybody.
Take care.